It's my pleasure now to introduce Linda Darling-Hammond, who we're very proud to say is the original founding executive director of NCTAF and still a very active commissioner on our commission. And so it's with great pride that I get to introduce her today, as she works very closely with our team. Many of you know that Linda is a true leader in education reform. She put teachers on the map in 1994, and she has dedicated her life's work to improving the teaching profession and learning opportunities for all children. Linda currently serves as a professor of education at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, but she also travels the world tirelessly to share research and best practices to improve the teaching profession. We are delighted that she is here today, and we look forward to her remarks as we think about the TALIS findings through the lens of the U.S. education landscape. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Linda, and while she comes to the podium, please give her a warm welcome.
Well, I want to start by thanking Melinda George and the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future for sponsoring this opportunity to unveil TALIS in the United States. NCTAF has been a critical voice for teaching and for moving us forward towards new visions of education that allow for good teaching for many years. I want to thank Andreas for being here again and his tireless work to bring so much of this amazing data to the United States. I want to applaud the U.S. Department of Education for its active engagement in this international conversation in this administration. This is the first time we've participated in TALIS, and I think we have people like Maureen McLaughlin, who's here, and Deb Delisle, and others, Arnie Duncan, to thank for that. And it really helps us really frame our conversation here. So there's a lot to both celebrate and puzzle about in this report. And I'm going to raise a few of the things that perhaps TALIS can tell us. Let me note, first of all, that we have for many years been looking at how the United States is performing on international benchmarks, like the Program in International Student Assessment, PISA, which many of us are now familiar with. It's been ongoing since 2003. This is another one of the many innovations that Andreas has taken responsibility for at OECD. And there is behind these achievement numbers a wealth of information about all the other things that are going on in systems that are allowing us to explore a lot of the at least correlations and associations in the data. The U.S., as you can see, has moved very little on PISA over the last 12 years between 2000 and 2012. We have been sort of at or around the OECD averages in reading and science and below in math, and in each of those categories our scores are somewhat lower and our rankings are significantly lower than they were in 2000. So that flags for us that we have a lot of work to do, and that the policy framework we've been using for the last 12 years may not be enough to achieve all of the goals that we have set for ourselves. This week, we received international evidence about teaching that perhaps gives some part of this picture, and I would say that in my reading of it, it provides a pretty stunning picture of the challenges experienced by American teachers and some provocative insights about what we might want to do to foster better teaching and learning in the United States. As I raise up a few of the findings to think about, I want to point out one other very important result from the last PISA analyses of the 2012 data. It hasn't been that many months since you were here helping us look at that, Andreas. And one of the very important findings that was explored in many dimensions in PISA was the fact that achievement and achievement gains appear to be very strongly associated with equity and resource allocation. And you can see the little red dot on the left there is the United States. We do not allocate our resources, our tangible resources in schools to give more advantages in resource experiences to students in schools with a lot of students in poverty. What's interesting is not only the usual high performers that we see at the far right-hand side of that chart, like Finland and Korea and some others, but the recent arrivals like Estonia and Poland and Vietnam that were moving up in their equitability of resource allocation and also raising their achievement over the last several years. So I think that's one of the sub-themes that needs to be related to the questions we ask about teaching. And how we're allocating our teaching resources across schools, and the extent to which we are compensating for the challenges that some students experience in their homes and communities. I would say that the short takeaway from TALIS for me was that American teachers today work harder under more challenging conditions than teachers elsewhere in the industrialized world. They also reported receiving less useful feedback and less helpful professional learning, and having much less time to collaborate in their work. As Andreas already said, 2/3 feel the profession is not valued by society, and OECD finds that related to student achievement. I just want to highlight how different the context is in the United States than many of the other countries. 64% of U.S. teachers in TALIS work in schools in which more than 30% of the students are disadvantaged. The next countries in that queue are Malaysia and Chile. The TALIS average is 20%. Many, many more of our teachers are working in high poverty settings. Many of us have been keeping tabs on the growth in poverty in this country. 1 in 4 children now live in poverty. Poverty for children has increased dramatically over the last decade. In fact, we have many more children in poverty now than we did in 1980. The number in severe poverty has increased. The number of children who are homeless has increased. The number who live in contexts where there is very little employment, access to healthcare, libraries, and recreation has increased. So this context is a very challenging one for educators as well as for families. Many educators spend a great deal of their time trying to help children and families manage these issues while they're also trying to close skill gaps and promote learning. On top of this, in the United States, unlike other TALIS, most of the other TALIS countries, we do not fund schools equally. In fact, there is a 3-to-1 ratio between high and low spending districts in most states, and a 3-to-1 ratio between high and low spending states. So there are dramatic differences in the resources that can be available to children in schools. Along with these challenges, U.S. teachers cope with larger class sizes, and they teach in larger schools with fewer teachers. Schools are not very different in size on average across the TALIS nations, but in a school with 546 students, in the average TALIS school, there would be 45 teachers. In the average U.S. school, there would be 38 teachers in a school that has some additional children. That's less person power to go around to get the job done of education. In fact, U.S. teachers, of course, then teach larger classes with the average of 27 as compared to 24. That may have been increasing during the recent cutbacks, the budget cuts that have been experienced in many states. So we may see climbing, because earlier statistics we have here would have suggested we were doing a little better than that. And as Andreas already said, U.S. teachers teach the most instructional hours, way above the average, 27 instructional hours, which is 40% above the TALIS average, which means that they have much less time to do a lot of the other things that allow them to prepare for teaching and so on. This is really a remnant of the factory model school that was brought into the United States framework in the early 1900s. The idea was that teachers are only working when they're actually seeing kids come past them on the assembly line, and in between there's really nothing for them to do because it's only about imparting the instruction. So we really need to be thinking about what we're going to be doing about designing schools. In higher education, let me show this. And of course, then, as Andrea said, U.S. teachers work more hours overall than teachers elsewhere. U.S. teachers then have very little planning time, and I would just point out that in higher education, we normally think of 2 hours of planning for each hour that we're meeting with a class. In K-12, in most TALIS countries, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 hour of time away from class for every hour in. In the United States, planning minutes per teaching hour for U.S. teachers are 16. So you're really trying to figure it out and dash it off. And it's no wonder that it would be hard to create very elaborate and creative plans under those circumstances. There's less time in the U.S. Schedule for and teachers' work week for planning, teamwork, and grading. There's more time for other tasks, about 3 times more. And I think that probably is capturing lunchroom duty, hall duty, and the other duties that many teachers still are performing. And U.S. teachers get quite a bit of professional development, as we saw, but they don't find it as helpful as some other teachers do. They do get a lot of feedback, but they also find that feedback somewhat less helpful. And I think there are a couple of things here. We looked earlier at the schools and staffing surveys, which are our own trend data. And what we saw over the course of the last decade is that, in fact, teachers are getting more opportunities for professional development, but fewer of those opportunities are sustained over time, where you have multiple days or even weeks of access to learning about a particular topic, which is the kind of professional development we know from research is more likely to impact teachers' practice and student achievement. And there's been an increase in the number of sort of one-shot, drive-by, spray-and-pray workshops, the one-day workshops. And so it's not surprising that while teachers are getting a lot of professional development, they may not be finding it very helpful, because there's a correlation between those two things. We also found that over the decade of the last decade, over the 2000s, that the amount of collaborative practice reported by teachers in their schools has gone way down. About 30% of teachers in 2004 felt that there was quite a lot of collaborative practice in their school. By the end of the decade, only 15% of American teachers felt that they were experiencing much opportunity for collaboration. You might ask, why are American teachers so satisfied if they have these conditions? And I scratched my head. The satisfaction rate was about 88% said that they felt pretty satisfied. And many of us remember the Met Life survey results that came out a year or two ago, where satisfaction overall, people saying they were pretty satisfied or very satisfied, went down from 94 to 81%, which is not so far off from these statistics we're seeing here. But what the MetLife data showed was that the percent of teachers who were very satisfied with their work had declined from 62% to 39%. So that was where the big drop was. And we'll need to explore these data further to see if there's a similar pattern here. Of course, that's the satisfaction level of those who have not yet left the profession, who are still there. And one of the things we know from other international data that I've been working on in a different study is that our attrition rates are much higher than attrition rates in other studies, at least for beginning teachers, where we see about 30% of beginners leave in the first 5 years. The comparable statistics in Australia, Singapore, and Canada range between 2 and 6%. So those who are the most dissatisfied apparently do feel that they can leave, and often do. So I think that's an area that we need to learn a lot more about. I will close with 4 areas that I think we need to be mindful of addressing in our policy framework. One is that we really have to continue to figure out how to do a better job of addressing the inequities that undermine learning. Every international indicator shows that the U.S. supports children less well than do other developed countries, ranging from health care, early childhood education, income supports, and so on. As I noted, the latest PISA report shows that The most successful nations allocate proportionally more resources to the education of disadvantaged students, so we do have a long way to go in figuring out how to address the conditions under which teachers are trying to do this work and students are trying to do their work. Just yesterday, a bill was dropped in the Senate by Senators Reid and Brown and by Representative Fudge in the House, the Core Opportunity Resources for Equity and Excellence Act, which actually specifies that states should be held accountable for making progress on resource equity while they're also being held accountable for making progress on achievement. The second issue is around teachers feeling valued and what we actually do to value teachers. Other OECD data show that U.S. teachers in tangible terms only earn about 60% of what the average college graduate earns in the United States as a tangible statement of value. In other countries that we see here that are high performing, it's typically closer to a 1-to-1 ratio between what other college graduates earn and what teachers earn. So some of this has to do with the language we use around teaching and the respect and status we accord to teachers, and some of it also has to do with whether we put our money where our mouth is with respect to making the job attractive and the conditions attractive. The third area, I think, is to continue to work to create meaningful teacher evaluations that foster improvement. I was really stunned to see that in the United States, teachers here get, 82% of them said they get feedback from their principal, and in other countries it was only 40%. And what that means is that in many countries, much of the feedback that teachers are getting is from master teachers, mentor teachers, and other peer teachers that they have time to observe or collaborate with or learn from. And that, we know from other research, is the most concrete, specific feedback. It's what are we doing about this curriculum and this topic to teach these kids? And it's probably one of the reasons that other teachers find more of their feedback helpful is that it's probably more fine-grained, more specific, more related to what they're actually doing in the classroom. And I think many districts have begun to experiment with peer evaluation and peer observation, professional learning communities, that all of these things point towards areas where we could help teachers more in getting the kind of feedback and support that they need. And then I think the last thing that this points to is the critical need for us to be more aggressive about redesigning our schools from the old factory model days to create time for collaboration. The point that is made about the amount of collaboration and the value of it in this report, that collaboration increases teachers' efficacy, and we know also that teachers' self-efficacy is related to their effectiveness in producing student learning gains. We've got to move beyond the idea that teachers are only working when they're in front of children and create the time, the opportunity, and the supports for collaboration that will allow both students and teachers to learn more effectively in our schools. Thank you very much.